authors are going to talk about their recent work of fiction or nonfiction or works in progress about the Anthropocene, the geological epoch distinguished by human impact. Where does nature end and where do we begin? Dale Jamieson and Bonnie Nadzam's book, Love in the Anthropocene, which has a fantastic cover, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, they put that question into sharp relief. Through this collection of eerie and evocative short stories, we are made to contemplate nature as artifact. In one story, we visit a dystopian vacation resort that feels like a blend between Abu Dhabi and the planet Tatooine. It's holiday for refugee camp workers, where daylight, time, temperature are all indicative of nothing, and there is no line between human and robot. Ulrich Baer has written a riveting collection of short stories called Beggar's Chicken, set in Shanghai, which are united by the universal longing of humans to feel connected. He's not talking about that book tonight. He's at work on a new novel with an environmental theme, climate fiction, cli-fi, and the name of the book is We Are But a Moment, and we'll hear more about that from him this evening. Roy Scranton's Learning to Die in the Anthropocene delves into the idea of learning to die in this era, and that means individuals having awareness of their own mortality, but also civilization contemplating its end. It's a call to action for new ideas, new myths, new stories, and a new philosophical humanism, and to quote him, a renewed attention to the humanities. Yanoula will be, I'm going to leave off your last name. Yanoula will be moderating our discussion tonight. And in the interest of time, I'm going to introduce everybody, but with a very, very short one-line bio per person so that we get to hear from our authors. They're going to read for us tonight. Ulrich Baer is a professor of German and comparative literature and serves as vice provost for faculty, arts, humanities, and diversity at NYU. He's a widely published author, editor, and translator. He's an expert on poetry, literary theory, and photography, and he's published extensively on these and other topics. Dale Jamieson is professor of environmental studies and philosophy, affiliated professor of law, affiliated professor of bioethics, and chair of the environmental studies department at New York University. He is the co-editor and editor of over 9 books, and most recently, Reflecting on Nature, Readings in the Environmental Philosophy, second edition. And he's published more than 100 articles or book chapters. Bonnie Nadzam is an American writer of essays, fiction, and poetry. Her work has appeared in Harper's Magazine, Orion Magazine, Granta, Epoch, the Iowa Review, and many other journals and magazines. Roy Scranton is the author of 3 recent books. His journalism, essays, criticism, scholarship, fiction, and poetry can be found in Rolling Stone, the New York Times, The Nation, and the Boston Review. And lastly, Yanoula Athanassakis, okay, thank you, is Assistant Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at NYU. She's also the co-founder of the NYU Environmental Humanities Series, and she's an instructor in comparative literature and environmental studies. Her book, Environmental Justice in Contemporary U.S. Narratives, comes out in January 2017 from Routledge. So with no further ado, Yanoula, it's to you.
So we're actually going to start in order and with short readings from each author, in one case co-authors, and that's something I definitely want to hear more about is that process of collaborative writing. I'm sure there were tears involved and a lot of fun at the same time. So Dale, we're actually going to start on that side of the table and come down this way. So we had spoken about the format, and so the first of 3 parts will be just a short reading by each author from their own work.
So Love in the Anthropocene consists in 5 short stories and 2 essays. And so I'm going to just read about 5 minutes from one of the short stories, and Bonnie will read about 5 minutes from one of the essays. And the short story that I'll be reading from is a story called Zoo. It was so old-fashioned, a blind date arranged by a common acquaintance. She was 2 years a widow, he a 45-year-old bachelor. She hadn't been game for meeting up until she found out what he did for a living. Even their meeting place was a throwback. They were tucked into the back of a small, chic restaurant in the heart of the city. They were at a table for 2 that was so small, their knees kept touching beneath it. He turned his chair sideways, took a sip of his drink, and shook his head as he swallowed. "God," he said and laughed, "you sound just like the school kids." No, she said, and smiled, and crossed her legs behind the table. Tell me. I just want to know what it's like. Do you pet her? Just like hang out with her? I usually wait until the second date to talk about the zoo. He winked and grinned at his own joke. She just stared at him. She was almost beautiful, he thought. Her eyes just slightly too close set, her nose just a little long. He liked her perfume, though. It reminded him of a citrus blossom, something he hadn't smelled for decades. Honest, he said, it's not as exciting as you might think. My father saw a bear once. The man shook his head and smiled. No, he didn't. She smiled back politely, but with her eyebrows furrowed and head tipped slightly, as though she didn't understand. You're saying he lied? I'm saying there's no way he saw a bear. He must have mistook something else. I mean, around here? Recently? This was 10 or 15 years ago, about 2 hours east. He shook his head again. I don't think so. She nodded, then lifted her drink and gazed across the restaurant. As the kitchen doors swung open behind her, the light within momentarily outlined her profile. Chin lifted, nose long and straight. He cleared his throat, opened his mouth to speak, and closed it again. This had been a bad idea from the start. She set down her glass and crossed her arms, studying the wall across the room behind his shoulder. The tables in the room were all full, the lights dim and rosy. It smelled like an expensive potpourri of garlic, white wine, eucalyptus, and roasting meat. There was a small trio of piano, muted sax, and bass coming from the far side of the room. The pleasant chime of silver and glassware. Anita, he finally said. That's the tiger's name. She glanced at him, and he raised his eyebrows. Did she want to hear about this? She turned her shoulders and faced him. I'd be so interested in hearing about her, she said, and picked up her drink again and leaned a little forward. Is she really the last tiger? Actually, no, he said. There's a Bengal in London, a male, but he's 18, even older. He told her what it was like, what the kids and zoo visitors always asked, and what he told them. They always wanted to know if he and the tiger were best friends, like, did he ever get in the pool and swim with the tiger? He always answered the same way. First of all, no, he and the tiger were not best friends. Second, no, they did not swim together. That would be terrible for the tiger and probably not very good for him either. Sure, the tiger was cute or beautiful, however you wanted to say it, but she could hurt a person, even unintentionally. Anita weighed in at over 300 pounds. She needed special, expensive medical care by highly trained veterinarians, 20 to 40 pounds of fresh meat per meal, and lots of space. And she was old. So you see, he said, shaking his glass to shift the ice around in his drink, not that interesting. I'm her caretaker, not her friend. Ideally, a tiger would want a tiger for a friend, like a girl wants another girl for a friend. But there are no other tigers for this tiger. Nope, he said. God, she shook her head, it's such a tragedy. He shrugged. Tragedy? I don't know about that. This is what we do. Kids get to run across the so-called savanna and boreal forest with a dozen virtual look-alike big cats. The zoo saves money on food and maintenance and vet bills. The city saves millions of gallons of water per year. Animal rights activists are finally happy. I'm sorry, because why? No animals in cages. Very few, anyway. Ah, okay, wow. She made an exaggerated frown, clearly in disagreement with this logic. Anita's a very spoiled, very comfortable cat, and everybody's happy, 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 happy. Except you, she tried. He put his hands up. Hey, I trained to work with animals, and I'm still working with one. I'm lucky. When Anita goes, they'll probably stick me with the last captive mongoose or put me in the gift shop. So good for everybody, she said. She looked skeptical, a single eyebrow raised. He could tell she wanted to have one of those conversations he hated. Wasn't it so tragic? Didn't he feel terrible all the time? Didn't he want to let the tiger go into the wild? To this last, he always wanted to respond, even if that weren't the most asinine idea I'd heard 1,000 times, where would this wild be? He opened his menu and scanned the first page. Good for everybody.
So I'm going to read, we have 2 essays in this book. The book opens with an essay on the Anthropocene, or Anthropocene, and I imagine most of you are familiar with that idea already. If not, you will be by the end of tonight. So I'm going to skip that essay and read a little bit from the coda, which is about love. And hopefully you'll get some sense of why we took this on, why love, and why fiction. Whatever our aspirations about love, the sad truth is that we betray our lovers, abuse our children and parents, and treat our animal companions as if they were extensions of ourselves with no needs of their own. Not always, but often enough. Almost any idea of what love is can be easy to accept in theory, but in the conflicts and contradictions of daily life, it is not easy to embody love in practice. As so many of our relationships have taught us, loving is a resolve we must return to again and again, 100, even 1,000 times a day. And it's almost never the simple head over heels, heart-stopping, once and for all experience we may fantasize about. What makes loving so hard to understand and even harder to practice? The novelist philosopher Iris Murdoch points to an answer when she writes, quote, "Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real," end quote. This realization that Murdoch calls difficult may seem obvious, but it is not. Love is the antidote to an all too familiar narcissism, one that mutates out of a necessary and healthy self-love that is a master of disguising itself just where we think love might be thriving. A high degree of self-absorption may have enabled human beings to survive in primal struggles for food and shelter, and may still help many of us get through days and nights that would otherwise seem crushing or demeaning. This kind of self-centeredness may have its place and purpose, but the job description of an overbearing, even tyrannical ego that may serve human beings well enough in difficult times is in need of a demotion from CEO to occasional advisor if we are ever to achieve the best of times. A ravenous ego can devour the very self whose interests it is supposed to serve. Who hasn't sensed this in the midst of a challenging relationship? Even when we're in love, or so we think, we find the dear self intruding like a jealous partner, trying to sabotage the possibility of intimacy with another. We see ourselves in others, but all too often, we only see ourselves. Murdoch's torturous realization, when it occurs, can come in extremely different forms. The realization that one's puppy is real, that one's lover is a distinct person, that the reality of the scorching winds of the desert cannot be denied, that an artist can speak to us across the centuries in her own pitch, timbre, and voice in a way that can change our lives. Murdoch's realization can even come when we pass strangers on the street, look into their eyes, and recognize that they too have experienced love, loss, fear, and joy as poignant and crushing as our own, though we may never know their stories. In addition to recognizing the fullness of others, love also involves sustaining sometimes uncomfortable, challenging, and fiercely intimate relationships. The paradox of love emerges in its demand to see the beloved as independently real, yet part of a larger conception of oneself. Once we grasp Murdoch's point, we see the most profound challenge of love in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene threatens to give us a narcissist's playground, a nature that is only the extension of ourselves and our desires without any independent meaning or sustenance. Loving relationships are not possible in a world that consists only of oneself and one's projections. In many ways, the task before us in the Anthropocene is the same task that has always been before us, to get the dear self out of the way enough to be able to really see and come to know, in relationship, the world of other people, plants, animals, oceans, and rivers around us. But there may be more at stake now as well. Love in the Anthropocene will present challenges that are even more extreme and which may make the ever difficult experience of loving even more disorienting and elusive than ever. Think, for example, of the movie Her, in which Theodore Twombly, Joaquin Phoenix, falls in love with an operating system, Scarlett Johansson. Or if this seems far-fetched, reach into your real or imagined memory and recover those feelings of joy and wonder as you were careering down the double black diamond runs in Tahoe or Vail. It was just you and the mountain, you and the wind. No condos, no snowmaking machines. Now imagine that Monsanto has brought you Ice 9, a nanoparticle that forms the nucleus for fluffy snowflakes that don't melt and stick. The snowmaking machines are gone, and every day is a powder day. Is this better? Do you love the experience more, or has the object of your love slipped away? We may once have thought of nature as the backdrop against which we lived our lives. Pretty scenery to be sometimes plundered for its resources or to write songs about. But the Anthropocene throws into stark relief that nature is not a background and never has been. It has always been part of our lives, a part of us as we are part of it. In the Anthropocene, the world is increasingly one of our own making, one that we do not know how to see, know, or love in Murdoch's crucial sense, not even when we have the best intentions. A natural resource manager may restore what he thinks of as wild landscape, but this wild landscape answers to our fantasy of the wild and is wholly dependent on human ingenuity and intervention for its existence. In losing nature as a fully independent partner, we will have lost our best teacher for learning that something other than ourselves is real, and thus a profound opportunity for learning how to love.
That was really moving, Bonnie. So this spring, I had a brief love affair with Houston, Texas, out of which came this rather long piece, an excerpt of which I recently published in the Times about what it will look like, when the next big storm hits Houston. I'm going to read some different parts of the larger essay out of which that piece was excerpted, which should be available in the Finnish art magazine Mustarinta in a month or two. So, look out for that. Imagine an oyster. Imagine waves of rain lashing concrete, a crawdad boil, a fallen highway, and a muddy bay. Imagine a complex system of gates and levees, the Johnson Space Center, a broken record on a broken player. Imagine the Baroque intricacy of the Valero Houston oil refinery, the Petrobras Pasadena oil refinery, the Lyondell Basel oil refinery, the Shell Deer Park oil refinery, the ExxonMobil Baytown oil refinery, a bottle of ravishing red nail polish, a glacier falling into the sea. Imagine gray-black clouds piling over the horizon, a chaos spiral hundreds of miles wide. Imagine a hurricane. Imagine Cobalt Yellow Lake. Imagine Cy Twombly's Say Goodbye, Catullus to the shores of Asia Minor. Imagine colony collapse. Imagine refugees drowning off the shores of Asia Minor. Imagine causality, a bicycle tire, 1 million lost golf balls, a styrofoam cooler, a bucket of crab claws, polyurethane, polypropylene, 3 copitas of mezcal, polyester, polyacrylic acid, polybutylene, terephthalate, barbecue sauce, polycarbonate, polyether ether ketone, polyethylene, a Waffle House, polyoxymethylene, polyphenol ether, polystyrene, the Wizard of Oz, polysulfone, polytetrafluoroethylene, polyvinyl chloride, a pair of pink Crocs. Imagine Greenland. Imagine Kellogg Brown and Root. Imagine Uber, the Svalbard Seed Vault, a roadkill raccoon, 6 months in juvie, Green Revolution, amnesia. Imagine ZZ Top. Imagine White Oak Bayou flooding its banks. Imagine Mexican gardeners swinging weed eaters. Imagine Boom and Bust, the murmur of Diane Rehm, Scissorp, a sick coot, Juneteenth, coral bleaching, amnesia. Imagine losing Shanghai, New York, and Mumbai. Imagine In the Mood. Imagine amnesia. Imagine Earth. Imagine pretty Hertz. Imagine Lakewood Church, wind-lashed magnolias, a bottle of Topo Chico, the Astrodome. Imagine surface and depth, weather drones, the ghetto boys, thermodynamic disequilibrium, a body in a hole. Imagine the economy slowing, snowy egrets nesting in a live oak, becoming one with the ocean of soul, a Colt Expanse carbine. Imagine purple drink and a bowl of queso. Imagine terms of endearment. Imagine stocks and flows, a pearl, a rhizome. Imagine the end of the world as we know it. Imagine black. Imagine black, 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 blue black, red black, purple black, gray black, black on black. Imagine methane. Imagine education. Imagine wetlands. Imagine a brown-skinned woman in white circling the Rothko chapel chanting zong, zong, zong. Imagine a regional comprehensive approach to storm surge risk management, lemonade, the slab parade, increased capacity, complexity, attribution studies, progress, a wine and cheese reception, tax stampede supercomputer, an integrative place-based research program, Venice's Piazza San Marco, sea level rise, Destiny's Child. Imagine a red line. Imagine 2 degrees. Imagine flare stacks. Imagine death. Maybe it was the 11th straight month of record-breaking warming. Maybe it was when the Earth's temperature hit 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. Maybe it was new reports that Antarctica and the Arctic were melting faster than anyone expected. Maybe it was when Greenland started melting 2 months early, and then so quickly that scientists didn't believe their data. Maybe it was watching our world start to come apart and knowing that nothing would be done until it was too late. We've known that climate change was a threat since at least 1988, and the United States has done almost nothing to stop it. Today, it might be too late. The feedback mechanisms that scientists have warned us about are happening. Our world is changing. Imagine we've got 20 or 30 years before things really get bad. Imagine how that happens. Imagine soldiers putting you on a bus. Imagine 9 months in a FEMA trailer. Imagine 9 years in a temporary camp. Imagine watching the rich on the other side of the fence, the ones who can afford beef and gasoline, the ones who can afford clean water. Imagine your child growing up never knowing satiety, never knowing comfort, never knowing snow. Imagine politics in a world on fire. Climate change is hard to think about, not only because it's complex and politically contentious, not only because it's cognitively almost impossible to keep in mind the intricate relationships that tie together an oil well in Venezuela, Siberian permafrost, Saudi F-15s bombing a Yemeni wedding, subsidence along the Jersey Shore, albedo effect near Kangerlussuaq, the Pacific decadal oscillation, the polar vortex, shampoo, California cattle, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, leukemia, plastic, paper, the sixth extinction, Zika, and the basic decisions we make every day, are forced to make every day, in a world we didn't choose but were thrown into. No, it's not just because it's mind-bendingly difficult to connect the dots. Climate change is hard to think about because it's depressing and scary. Thinking seriously about climate change forces us to face the fact that nobody's driving the car. Nobody's in charge. Nobody knows how to fix it. And even if we had a driver, there's a bigger problem. No car. There's no mechanism for uniting the entire human species to move together in one direction. There are more than 7 billion of us, and we divide into almost 200 nations, thousands of smaller subnational states, territories, counties, and municipalities, and an unimaginable multitude of corporations, community organizations, neighborhoods, religious sects, ethnic identities, clans, tribes, gangs, clubs, and families, each of which faces its own internal conflicts, disunion, and strife, all the way down to the individual human soul in conflict with itself, torn between fear and desire, hard sacrifice and easy cruelty, all of us improvising, day by day, moment by moment, making decisions based on best guesses, gut hunches, comforting illusions, and too little data. But that's the human way, reactive, ad hoc, improvised. Our ability to reconfigure our collective existence in response to changing environmental conditions has been our greatest adaptive trait. Unfortunately for us, we're still not very good at controlling the future. What we're good at is telling ourselves the stories we want to hear, the stories that help us cope with existence in a wild, unpredictable world. Imagine life. Imagine a hurricane. Imagine a brown-skinned woman in white circling the Rothko Chapel chanting Zong. Imagine grief. Imagine the Greenland ice sheet collapsing and black-crowned night herons nesting in the live oaks. Imagine Cy Twombly's Say Goodbye, Catullus, to the shores of Asia Minor, amnesia, a broken record on a broken player, a tar-stained bird, the broke complexity of a flooded oil refinery, glaciers sliding into the sea. Imagine an oyster. Imagine gray-black clouds piling over the horizon, a sublime spiral hundreds of miles wide. Imagine climate change. Imagine a happy ending.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. We are but a moment, day one. You make the bed you lie in, they say, but in this case, it's Zaha Hadid who made the bed. I'm prone on the floor in front of Hadid's curvy creation, slight ripples pressing into my butt and back. The room's floors, walls, and ceiling all molded out of a plastic that feels like a cat's tongue. The bed is curved like everything else in this room: walls, door frames, a fixed table, a chair. Instead of windows, display screens all around, an opening for medical staff to reach into the pod. The surfaces are probably coated with something so that bacteria won't stick. It's not a big room, for sure, but the bed and table flip up so I have space to exercise, like a college dorm room or a cheap hotel. No sharp edges to avoid injury and to discourage those in quarantine, I'm one of those for the time being, from getting any funny ideas about how to cut short the incubation period by their own doing. It feels like being in a spaceship, or as if I am a seed expected to sprout. I arrived yesterday and slept for a couple of hours. I'm exhausted from the processing that followed the determination that I had been exposed by one of the doctors who'd come to see me at the White House for debriefing from a hotspot. Positive, a technician had mumbled without so much as looking up at me from the monitor he was holding in front of him like a medieval shield. It was a whirlwind after that. Getting checked by the White House doctor, rushed by ambulance to a better hospital in Maryland, and from there deposited here. It all worked well under the circumstances, just as we had designed. RWS, that's what we call it, what I'm going through right now, real world scenario. Just funny that I'm the one out of all the people on our team who has to test drive the whole thing. Not really funny, ironic. The air is being sucked out and filtered, and the small drains on the floor will also suck out any fluids. The toilet, even with Zaha Hadid's genius design, has no lid and looks like something you'd see in prison. The small windows on the door can be closed on my side, but it's easy to spot the tiny recessed lenses in the ceiling and wall, so I know I'm never quite alone. Well, it's not supposed to be a vacation. What we developed here is something to protect the population at large if there's a risk of contagion. I will be in here for exactly 6 days. Then I'll be released, free to go, unless incubation occurs, but I don't want to think about what happens then. The rate of developing symptoms hovers near 60%. So I have 1 in 3 chances of getting out of here. I haven't exactly been a model of health, but I'm 34, obviously haven't eaten meat in a long while, don't smoke, don't drink much, take edibles only occasionally, consume a pretty good amount of sea minerals, thank you, Kion, take all of my boosters and have no major health problems. That takes me out of the high-risk group. Mexico. The bodies had been burned. The heads had been placed atop crude wooden spikes all along the town's main road. Some of them still wore baseball caps with the Global Alliance insignia. Most of the women's heads still had their hair tied back in ponytails or tucked under bandanas. There was an expression on their mutilated faces. It was of great surprise, as if they still could not believe that they were stuck on tall poles. Our faces were expressions of shock, not surprise. We had regular briefings about the narco gangs' beheadings of Mexican students, hotel workers, civil servants, local officials, bus drivers, and teachers as retribution for governmental action. State alerted us each time U.S. citizens were among the victims, which was often the case now. None of us had been prepared for the stench. The smell was sweet, but also sharp, as if tiny insects had invaded our nose and throat. We walked along in silence. Lucia stopped before each head and looked intently into the open eyes, a handkerchief pressed against her mouth. Judging from the open gashes, crows and turkey vultures had pecked at the heads before we arrived. The officials had left them up for us to see. At the last spike, Lucia bent down and placed a bouquet of origami flowers at its base. The detail was around her. She tied a green paper ribbon around the stake. She stood there for a few long moments while everyone else waited in the heat. It felt wrong not to pay these people our respect, but it was also grotesque to look directly into their wide-open eyes. Our plane had landed after military convoys had already brought several battalions to the region. The severed heads, as gruesome as they were, had only been a small part of the reason for our presence here. Heads had been displayed in Mexican towns for a while since the narco war started. Bodies strung on lampposts and from bridges, charred corpses buried by the dozens in shallow ditches or left helter-skelter on manicured lawns in front of fancy hotels and colonial-era city halls after being dumped from pickup trucks in the soft light of dawn. A dozen or so flayed hands arranged into a horrid mandala on the conference table of Mexico City's mayor one Monday morning. The methods were medieval, but the message was wholly timeless. We run this place. Gobernamos este país, GEP. You could see the acronym graffitied everywhere, on highway overpasses, on columns, and on walls, emblazoned on the sides of buses and delivery trucks, and even inside restaurants, on bathroom walls and doors. The victims of the narco wars, the world was told. Each time another batch of bodies was discovered, the hand-wringing, the social media campaigns, the political blame game started up again. We touched down near Mexico City a bit after noon. In a heavily secured room crowded with computer terminals, we stared at several large screens displaying rows of numbers, large numbers in the billions, and then fanned out to smaller amounts, all headed by generic North American names that I can still recall: Scott Cosgan, Liz Apple, Rowan Patrick. Also on display were graphs and numbers that spelled out much of the narco empire's banking practices, which our team of cyber warriors led by Asturias and Malang had hacked. The rows of numbers cascading down the screen represented the enormous drug profits of the Mexico-based cartels. They all flowed in one direction, into U.S. accounts from everywhere around the globe where drugs were sold: Cairo, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Hong Kong, Mumbai, New York, Bangkok, all of the European capitals. Our geeks had used cyber markings to trace those accounts directly to dummy accounts set up by the campaign offices of the governors of Texas and California, one from each of the two major parties. I want to see the canals, Lucia said, pointing at the screen displaying the money that had gone to California. I want to know how much water we are talking about here, she said. In exchange for the narco dollars that ended up in the campaign coffers and private offshore accounts of California and Texas politicians, the two governors had turned a blind eye to the many networks of underground pipes, the canals that Lucia had wanted to see, that siphoned water from California and Texas underneath the fortified border to the Mexican peninsula. The scheme was simple but clever, and it had taken years to uncover. Bank points and dollars flowed to Mexico, while the authorities used the severed heads and mutilated bodies provided by the drug cartels as a way to control the news and public political priorities. A distraction. Nothing more, nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So the first question that I had for everyone was why the medium of writing? And all three works really blur the boundaries of both genre and form. And for those of you that haven't read Uli's book, since it's not available yet, I believe, right?
Yes.
Yeah. In the not too distant future, it has a female president, so it definitely is also playing.
That's right.
Yes, with certain things that might be reality. So really, in a time when books are challenged as a medium and when writing is thought to be passé, and visual culture is often heralded as the way to communicate, why is it that the four people to my right are choosing to write and find it to be very meaningful and moving, especially with such a heavy subject matter? And so one thing is, I wonder if everyone here knows what the Anthropocene refers to, or how to pronounce it, which I think we go back and forth on. It's worth noting that it was coined in about the 1980s and entered the modern day lexicon in around 2000. And so it's an era that we're in of profound and immutable change that humankind has made on Earth systems. So Dale, you get to go first and tell me, I know you're so happy, to, but why writing?
Why write?
Mm-hmm. And why write with somebody? I really want to hear about this process, because when you write, you're your own maybe worst enemy. I am, right? So I would think it would be good to have somebody to help you.
It's like a small support group.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I think probably for a lot of people in this room, I mean, writing is like breathing. I mean, what does one do to know how to live and what to think, except to write? As for how Bonnie and I came to write together, I think I would rather let her say something about that first.
Okay. Yeah, this question, I think, is sort of a back and forth, at least in regards to this particular book. So Dale and I have been friends for a long time, and sort of in an intellectual way, in a context of environmental ethics. And there was one year, what was like maybe 3 years ago, that we were just like both sort of in a personal crush of various kinds, and we're talking on the phone and Skyping a whole lot, and talking about loving relationships and how they're being changed by technology. And then, like, a really crazy example was something like Tinder, which now is like, as old a word as a bus or something. But it was like a new thing back then. And so we started to imagine how technology would impact what we understand to be loving relationships. And then not just romantic, but all kinds of relationships. And then not just human to human, but human to non-human, and human to all kinds of sentient beings, and maybe even what some people think of as non-sentient landscapes, and et cetera. And how that a world that is almost exclusively designed by humans, if there would be even a possibility of love, what it would look like. And so I'm a fiction writer by trade. I have a couple novels and many stories out in the world. And for me, it's a natural question to say, well, what if? And let's just, start from there and imagine. So we started going back and forth. Stories have a way of going straight to the heart, the way, I think it's the sense of smell is supposed to be the one sense that bypasses some linguistic thing in your brain and goes straight to your gut, so to speak. So when you smell something like a citrus blossom perfume, you're immediately transported. Maybe you know what that's like. You catch a whiff of something. Stories are more like that than essays are. And so that's why we thought stories. Let's go to the emotional core, try to get people by the throat with some of this stuff in ways that models and essays are sort of incapable of doing.
Amen.
Oh, you made me say everything.
Thank you. Roy, what about you? Why writing?
I write because I have yet to free myself from the compulsion to write.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that's the tool I have, I guess, to think about the world and understand it and connect to other people. But I do think I sort of make an argument in the Learning to Die in the Anthropocene for the value of the humanities and the value of humanistic reflection, and in that way, I would make a kind of maybe a sort of Luddite argument for the virtue of writing as a kind of a kind of archaic technology that slows down some of the reflective and reactive processes that we're so wired into now, that I think are some of the most dangerous possibilities for some of the most dangerous potential in our transition into whatever's coming after this, like whatever the Anthropocene is going to look like. I think a lot of the way that we're wired into very fast, connected technologies that move affect around. I think that's very dangerous. And writing, especially more reflective writing, I think can slow that down some.
Thank you. That connects really nicely with Bonnie and Dale's book as well, because you had written, I remember that one quote that, what is it, technology and the Anthropocene, you must know the quote, are joined at the hip. Yes, joined at the hip. And I think, Roy, what you're saying is that you're trying to sort of decouple that in a way through, or the writing may decouple the speed.
Right. I don't think humans can live without technology. But everything, is a kind of technology for us, including language, right? It's an interface. And I guess writing I would just see as a technology with certain benefits that I think might be better for us in terms of compassion and reflective thought and wisdom than Twitter or Tinder, for example.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for letting me be on the panel. I love the two books that are discussed here. I really think everybody who hasn't read them, you should read them. Really beautiful writing. I wrote this book. It's not meant to be read. It's supposed to be heard. I want this to be an audiobook, and I want you to listen to it. And I think the human voice is a really major thing that people can connect to and be in someone else's head or mind for a long time. So actually, I felt I was hearing Bonnie and Dale, and I was hearing Roy, who I just met now, but I'd heard him in my head for a long time now, reading the book. And there's something very powerful about inhabiting someone else's frame of mind for a while. I don't know how to say that word, the Anthropocene, so I'm one of those people. But when people are thinking about that this is a world that's supposed to be new and different because humans have shaped or influenced some parts of it, the world is what we make, co-create. The meaning of the world is what human beings create. So I think fiction has a really major role in that. As Bonnie said, storytelling is really essential. I write a lot of nonfiction, and then this book was in my head. I just had the whole book in my head, and it takes place all over the world. I just gave you Mexico. It takes place in Senegal, Australia, and Tokyo. We lose the harbor. The elephants die out. It's not a really positive book for parts of it, but there's also some hope because it's people trying to work together to do something. So my character is a junior aide in the White House, and has 5 days to reflect because he's been locked in quarantine. So he says he's going to reconstruct what happened. And that's part of what we do, to try to account of who we were and what we've been doing and to move forward. That's storytelling. And then there is a relation to me between fiction and the world that's very deep. That is, world making is an activity we all engaged with all the time, of what's meaningful to us and what's not meaningful. And a lot of things we edit out and ignore, and a lot of things we pay attention to, and that becomes our life world and our world. So I think fiction has that capacity, and if we shift it a little bit, people could see worlds from different places in different ways. And I couldn't see a nonfiction way to write, to actually articulate that the whole world is there. I could do this. I could jump around and go to all these different places and take all these different things. In an essay or a book of nonfiction, it sort of becomes a kind of display of something like that. So I think there's something on the inside of the language that actually you build out from that. So you can't answer certain things, and fiction is not meant to be open-ended, that you can imagine anything you want, but fiction is supposed to remind you of our capacity to create the world. It's a very different thing. It may also not turn out so nicely, and my book is a little dark in the end, so it's not a promise something will be good. So I'll stop right here.
Great.
I'll read the rest now. Okay.
So something that comes across in all three works is that the Anthropocene is not a picture that's painted with bright and happy colors, even if you have love in your title and in the book. I think it's asking us to reflect deeply on the state of the earth and climate change. And so something we hear about a lot in the humanities is our relevance, or we hear that we need to defend as our relevance, and what kind of a difference we can make. And so I'm sort of interested to hear from all of you, what difference do you think it makes to write in the mode of fiction or creative nonfiction rather than quote unquote nonfiction? How is that powerful or moving, or how does it interact with the public in a different way? And while we think about that a little bit, I want to say that in Uli's book, the iPad features prominently as a technological tool, and so I just am starting to think more about how technology and catastrophe are really linked in all three works. Also because in Bonnie and Dale's work, we're asked to sort of move back away from technological means and sort of return to a more pastoral way of life in some of the stories. So Dale and Bonnie, you have the honor of going first again.
When I hear that, I think the first shall be last. So for me, I started working on climate change in the 1980s, and I got involved in the climate change issue because I was hanging around with a bunch of climate modelers. And so here were my friends who were producing all this incredibly important data in a form that was highly unintelligible, right? We should freak out because the Earth's mean surface temperature might exceed 3 or even 4 degrees centigrade. Well, Americans don't even know what centigrade is, right? I mean, what does a mean? What does it mean to talk about a mean? We don't know what means are, and the whole idea of Earth's temperature is a complete scientific construct. We don't go around sticking thermometers into the planet and taking its temperature. So the very first paper I wrote about climate change was actually a paper called Grappling for a Glimpse of the Future. And the paper ends by saying, we actually need more science fiction rather than more science. So I think very early on in my interest in the climate change issue, I really felt that if this issue were going to be communicated to people, it had to be communicated in some way through stories. So let me just leave it at that.
Okay.
The article that Roy just mentioned that came out in the New York Times, what's the title of it?
Another Storm is Coming.
Another Storm is Coming. I recommend it if you haven't read it yet. And there are a couple things in it that I want to touch on. One is a comment that came after, should you or should you not read the comments? It's a good anthropological exercise. And one of the comments sort of dismissed what Roy had written because he's an English professor. And why should you not? I hope this is okay because obviously I'm on your side here. And why should he have to mention any facts or science, to hell with all that. And you would think this is kind of dangerous ground talking about climate change and fiction in the same breath. But what that comment revealed to me is yet again, what an overemphasis there is in valuing certain kinds of stories. And this, for this particular commenter, the story that he or she wanted was the evidence-based science. It's also a story. And a very, very powerful, mesmerizing story. Also in this article, and Roy just read from it, one thing that we're so good at, I don't know if as humans, but definitely in our culture, and I'm saying our to mean where we are right now. I know that there are probably many cultures represented here tonight, but like the general fast-paced, high-tech Anthropocene culture is telling ourselves stories that make us feel better about our existence, finding consoling stories. And I think I'm really interested in questions of how we mimic, embody, and thereby incarnate the stories we're telling ourselves, especially the ones we're not aware we're telling ourselves. So I guess you could call those delusions. How do we incarnate the delusions that we're repeating to ourselves all the time? And so to be aware of all of these interfaces as stories seems really, really, really important to me, not just in terms of these kinds of questions, but on a daily life level and scale, to be aware of our own delusions and the stories we're telling ourselves.
Thank
or
you.
else.
Yeah, I think that's and I would want to add to that, because I think that's one of the best things that fiction can do, or creative nonfiction, whatever those words mean, and poetry or what have you. More imaginative experimental uses of language is that it can help us make us aware of the stories that we tell ourselves, our collective delusions, and it can also help interrupt those delusions, sort of by jamming up the stories, or breaking them open, presenting them in strange and unusual ways that make us see the myths and fantasies and the ways that we structure reality, and that it can also bring that way can bring the world back to us afresh, right? Not just the delusions, but also the actual facts, that Dale is talking about, the actual facts of things that we so often don't want to think about. There's a couple other things that I think the creative arts in language can really do and help with. I think one is that the future's uncertain and the end is always near, and somebody's gonna have to build something. Some humans are gonna have to build a future. We're not gonna do it, but I feel like one of the things that we can do now is to try to offer something to future generations, that if they're, assuming there are future generations, that might be able to give them something of what we've accumulated in culture in the past, be able to pass that on. And I think the techniques of creative arts and fiction and narrative might be able to pass that on more easily, and also open up other possibilities. The last thing I would say is that I think, and this relates to the delusion, fact, myth sort of issue, is that I don't think I think the Anthropocene, and I think and climate change is actually really destabilizing our conceptual framework for the world that we live in, and a lot of the things that prop that up are no longer convincing or compelling. They no longer motivate us in the ways that they did, because they don't map. And so I think, going into weirder choices, going into the strange choices, exploring new ways of representation, even outside of realism, into science fiction, into fantasy, whatever. I think that there's a richer sort of set of possibilities there that might help us better understand our current situation.
Thank you so much. So Uli is director for the Center for the Humanities. It falls to you to tell us of the relevancy. No, I'm joking. We know that.
No. I do want to say something. I'm sort of not totally clear whether I get, because I don't think this is that fiction is more experimental or poetry is than nonfiction. I don't think there's sort of facts and then there's this other stuff and I teach poetry and I like poetry, I write fiction. But I think there's a kind of precision in fiction in the space where we're not so sure about our moral choices. Mm-hmm. And I actually have a sense that in this moment right here that we're in, that I don't use the word climate change in this novel at all. My main thread, I think, through it is population. I think that's the big thing I'm invested in, and that doesn't talk about fossil fuels and carbon offsets and all this and this kind of technology, but it talks about human beings on the planet, and there's a lot of people. And it's a global book because a lot of people have very different approaches to where they are, because they ended up in this place from very different places. So there's 2 billion people being told on the planet, you really shouldn't be living like this with air conditioning and lights and nice water, because that would really screw up the planet even more. That's what I went into, and I thought fiction has a way to delineate the moral ambiguity, that there will be decisions that are not really palatable, with absolute precision, without resolving, and not in a kind of open-ended, anything goes, but there's a kind of precision in fiction that I think is slightly different. So I don't know if you know what I mean? It's not richer, better, it's just different. it's a different way of being and knowing in the world. The way being in love is a different way of being in the world from other ways of being in the world. I think it opens up this other, and I just don't know. I also feel I would be reluctant to defend fiction against anything because it's just not it's not a winning proposition in a certain way, but the storytelling is real, human interaction is real, so I feel fiction is that. But the genre of literature and poetry, I think, that's, in some ways, I try to do it and not talk about it. I sort of just did it and see where that works. It's an experiment. But you know what I mean when I say that it's not rich or different? It's different, but not in a way of either better or worse or more accurate, less accurate. And I think it can be incredibly precise to write fiction and poetry.
I would come back on one point in that I do think, or at least the way I think of fiction and creative nonfiction and poetry and some of these other artistic forms of linguistic creation is that there's a concern with form, which is sort of central and preeminent, and it's that concern with form, with patterning, that I think makes it a possibly richer way to approach a novel situation, because the question isn't just what information do I need or how do I tell this, or how do I get this across, but how do I shape a thing in order to respond to a whole new thing, whole new space.
Just one comment on this is the book I published before the book I just spilled water on was a book called Reason in a Dark Time, which was a nonfiction book about climate change. And it was a book I worked on for many, many years. And so you know how friends are. They're always doing these horrible things to you, like asking you when you're going to finish your book. And so I got into this thing where my standard response was when I find out how the story ends. And the hardest thing about writing Reason in a Dark Time was really finding the narrative for the nonfiction story that I wanted to tell. And so I think this concern for narrative and storytelling, at least for me, really runs through everything that I write, and it's always the hardest thing to get. And when you get it, then everything else tends to fall into place.
Yeah, they're all stories. I mean, when you find something that isn't a story, you find yourself in really deep, profound silence, which is a wonderful thing, and I recommend going for it. But something else that I like, this idea of a different kind of precision that fiction has. Like, everything in this is true, I hope, even if none of it has happened yet. Although much of it is in the news now. It's like we didn't quite cast far enough into the future. Almost everything we came up with I hear about on NPR. It's only a year old. But there are questions that are raised in the Anthropocene that are can't really be answered by certain kinds of stories. Not can we do this and how much will it cost and what will it look like, but should we do this? And what will happen if we do? And these questions are inherently speculative, and how to approach an answer to them, but by imagining. And I find it so beautiful that so many of Roy's sentences began with imagine, imagine. It's really all we've got to work with right here.
When I go back to the form thing, I think that actually really helps me. It's not that fiction sort of is free for everything, but it creates new forms, and we may need different forms, and there are stories that we know. There's romance, there's tragedy, there's certain genres we're very familiar with. They're going to end badly, they're going to end well. Someone wins, there's redemption. But so what kind of stories do we need right now? And I actually think the genre that there's Netflix and all these things, that's great. It's still stories, and people are very experimental right now. I think it's a great moment actually for fiction. People are inventing all sorts of new ways of doing narrative and all of that. One thing about the imagination, but we also know a lot of things already. We've made decisions. I mean, I wrote this book partly because I did some research, which was very simple to do. It took me not that long. I had a student who went to Sierra Leone to photograph the Ebola crisis, and Tish graduate, NYU graduate student, young man, 24 years old, got an assignment, went there, won a major award, and published his pictures in the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker. You can't really get better than that as a young photojournalist. And he came back, and I've had him in my class a few times, and he's really devastated because he got huge acclaim, professional recognition and standing for photographing something that he says is still going on, has not at all been resolved. And this is the number that really triggered a lot of this book. We spent $600 on each person in Sierra Leone who got admitted to a hospital, not people who died at home, but people who actually got medical care, $600. There's one American who came to New York City, actually two, but the one we spent $800,000 on that person because he came to this country. And I think if you do that on the scale of what's happening still in Sierra Leone today, I thought, okay, this is not imaginary. Sort of, I said, what are we doing with this? We're already making decisions every day. So I thought we're in this place as it is, and maybe fiction allows us to be in this place more deeply, because when I tell you those two numbers, you're going to all think, oh, what are you supposed to do? That's awkward or uncomfortable or politically incorrect. And so I thought, if you're in this space, and I spent a lot of time with my student who was a bit modeled on this because he came back from Sierra Leone and locked himself in a cabin upstate for 21 days because he had a fever. He didn't want to check himself in. So this is actually very real. This is not totally, I'm not writing science fiction like I'm on Mars, I'm Matt Damon, but I'm actually writing a book about what is happening right now in the world for lots of people. So I think it's both and what you're saying, the list of what you're imagining, it's all there, right? It's not you made it up. It's all there, right?
Okay, I would love to go to Q&A because I'd really like to hear people's questions. We're so grateful to you for coming this evening, and I'm so grateful to everybody on the panel. And I think it's important that we make time to hear your thoughts and comments, and importantly, if you have questions, we would really like to take them. Yes.
First of all, thank you for your writing and your reading. A short anecdote. When I was a sophomore in high school, I had a geography teacher who used to come in and teach us how to read the New York Times on a subway using the pole. So one day he comes in and he's reading an article about how the youth of today are disrespectful, they don't listen to their elders, and all these negative things. And he's reading from the New York Times, so we thought it was topical. Then he points out it was written by Socrates about the youth of Athens. And the message was, human nature doesn't change. So, and Shakespeare says, nothing new under the sun. There are, 7 plot forms and 57 subplots. We know all this. But as to writing, you talk about why you write. I heard an article today, a couple of days ago, by the author of Tuesdays with Maury, and he says the main problem with education in youth today is that over 50% of Americans are functionally illiterate. So for all those writers, if there are not going to be any readers, what happens to writing? And as educators, the base foundation is we have to learn or be encouraged to read. So without readers, what's the use of writing?
Is that a question? I'm wondering, is that a question?
How do you get the literacy rate up to 100% rather than 50%? Because otherwise, what you get is all the problems. They don't read about it.
Well, since I'm a product of them, I feel like I can say we have to eliminate all the creative writing programs because clearly there are way too many writers and not enough readers, and all that energy should go into, like preschool literacy education. So some kind of socialist program, I guess, that would keep people from writing new novels and force them to teach children.
I'm having trouble reading irony on this panel right now, so if someone can help me, that would be great. Roy, you look like you have...
I'm skeptical of some of these claims about, the kids today, they're not reading, especially given how much. I know there's numbers that show that Americans, for example, just aren't reading as many books as they used to. But we're all on these devices all the time, and we're reading all the time. It's just a different kind of reading and a different kind of literacy. again, I'm very much a proponent of old school like paper and books for a lot of reasons, not least because I think it slows down, like I said before, like it slows down the way that we process these social feelings, right? It slows down the way we react to it and the way that we respond to it. If you have to sit and write a letter to the editor, there's a different kind of transmission going on than an instant tweet or an instant reposting of some article. And that's a question about the way that we structure society through these different symbolic technologies. And so, unplug the internet, but like, what does that mean? I don't even know. So, yeah.
No, that's a good question. Yeah, we might take a couple of questions in the interest of time.
That's a great idea.
Hello, thank you for such an interesting panel. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. I'm writing a book myself more on visual culture of the Anthropocene, focusing on the Arctic and the Antarctic, because sometimes I think it's really helpful to work on particular geographical sites. But I was wondering, I mean, one of the issues I'm facing is sort of shifting away from certain kinds of apocalyptic representations and the work that I'm writing on, which is sort of experimental cinema and art. I tend to choose pieces that are, sort of working more like, I would say, Ulrich Baer's work, in the sense of, dealing with the violence, the unexpected connection between different regions of the world, and the politics of this as well, and the potential violence. And I feel like, in terms of the arts, much of the work is not coming from the United States. Museums and various institutions are not necessarily showing work on the Anthropocene because of the oil and gas industries in this country. And so, to me, fiction is an interesting sort of way to approach it, because you're less likely to be censored in a certain sense. So I was wondering what you thought about how you're, gauging your narratives in terms of not overwhelming the audience who, perhaps in the context of the U.S., is already very uneasy with the topic, because it really hasn't gotten that much representation, except in very sort of, very iconic ways, like the polar bear, et cetera. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Dale, I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I think we're going to take a couple questions.
Okay.
Sorry.
You can say while we're waiting.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful panel. It seems to me that there's a link that's being made here between fiction writing or storytelling and ethics. And I just wanted to sort of query that a little bit, just because if fiction or storytelling is going to somehow help us make a world that is not the world that we currently have, why is it that storytelling has not done this already? And I was thinking about, particularly, somehow there's a parallel for me in your piece, Ulrich Baer, about the heads on the stakes, and Conrad's Heart of Darkness, there are also heads on stakes. And that book, obviously controversial though it was, had a sort of an agenda, an anti-colonial agenda, subtending it, as well as a very racist one. I love the idea that fiction or storytelling is going to help prevent the catastrophic apocalypse, but it seems to me that may be a false linking, because fiction also does terrible things.
Yeah, I don't think there's a prescriptive dimension. I said there's no prescriptive dimension, and ethics is not the category I would use with the planet. It's not. I don't actually quite think that's the right category. So I understand what you're saying. I actually don't. I mean, I don't believe that. In some ways, when you said fiction won't make for a better world, but you also can't prove the opposite, that fiction hasn't helped to make things better. In some ways, you can't say, oh, it hasn't helped. What do we know? Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. Of course, in some instances, it doesn't. But I think that's what I said earlier. It's not ambiguous in a meaningless sense, but it reminds us of our capacity to imagine the world, whether it's good or bad. We know there are very powerful fictions and fantasies that are incredibly destructive. Incredibly. So it's not a prescriptive, and I'm not even sure you can enlist fiction to combat climate change. people are going to come up with stories how it's not even a problem. So,
Well, a lot of this depends on what you mean by better. And what drives me crazy about our political culture and about our response to climate change is its dishonesty. And I think that, as Bonnie said earlier, fiction can be another way of truth-telling. And the better world that I want is a world in which people actually look the world in the eye. They look at the consequences of their actions in the fullness of what that means, and then decide what to do. And I think fiction has an important role to play in bringing about that kind of honest engagement with the world. And there's just one little example of that I want to give, because it's kind of been bouncing around in the background here, is one of the things that annoys me is the way ideas of catastrophe get used all the time. And in part because when we tend to think about the future, we get very catastropharian. And I always, this is one of my old jokes, I prefer Rastafarian to catastropharian. But it tends to do two things that I think are really bad. One is, and I think this was something Uli was getting at in a different way, is it obscures the catastrophe that we've normalized and that we live with as part of everyday life by projecting it out into the future. But secondly, it also obscures the fact that for rich people in rich parts of the world, there's going to probably to be a kind of banality about climate change, or at least a lot of climate change. And one of the things that many people are going to have to learn to live with is increasing injustice, increasing privilege, and their role in perpetuating that and benefiting from it in a way that, in many cases, they will continue to feel even powerless to change, in the way that many of us today feel powerless to change unjust conditions that we're aware of. So these, to me, are all ways in which you can do truth-telling in fiction, and in that sense make the world better, whatever people decide to do with it.
I think Bonnie, did you want to, and then we'll take two questions after you.
Okay, just to speak really quickly to what this banality of the apocalypse and representing apocalypse in either visual representational forms of art or fictional, verbal. It's funny to me in a way that you would be going to the Arctic or Antarctic to do it, because I just arrived here from rural Wisconsin today, where I live in a cabin surrounded by trees and hills. And this is a pretty apocalyptic place. I mean, why are you guys not all totally alarmed 24/7? It is so much. And every window I look out of, I'm like, this is not ending well. Not this is not going to end well, but this is not ending well. So how do you represent what is normally around us, what we've normalized, as Dale says, in a way that defamiliarizes it and makes somebody go, oh, we're all paying to drive out of the city and go see the trees? Why is this not registering as problematic?
Yeah.
No, we're going to take a few more.
And I want to sort of double down on that and add to what Bonnie said. I think there's not enough not enough apocalypse. We're not thinking hard enough about the apocalypse. We're not thinking. I mean, it's already here. It's the world we already live in, and part of one thing I do think we need to do is shift our thinking about the apocalypse from being an event to being an epoch, an era, a time. And I think that's one of the useful things about the idea of the Anthropocene. But I think we need more apocalypse thinking rather than less. And on the question of fiction and ethics, I don't think, so I'm not trying to argue that fiction has a particular ethical power or valence, although that there's an argument to be made there. What I'm interested in, I guess, what I was trying to articulate there was that I think creative work, whether it's fiction or creative nonfiction, whatever that means, concern with form can help articulate emergent possibilities, right? Things that we haven't thought yet, right? But are beginning to think, right? And I think the arts can help us articulate those and bring them out, right? And that's that I think is a value. Yeah.
Thank you. I think there are two comments in the back.
Hi. I believe that maybe it's a little tricky to think that climate change and Anthropocene is a contemporary problem, is a current problem. Because if we imagine that like from the rise of the seas and all that may happen is a long-term process, and also that what you write and what we do is not trying to affect the present, but trying to affect the passing of time, and we want to change things in the long terms. So don't you think it's kind of, with the Anthropocene and all this move, should we change also the name that we call ourselves, like the contemporary literature, as he's going to suggest in his book, like the contemporary society? Should we also move on from this name and try to also, in the name, incorporate a long-term mentality? Because this name doesn't have any sense of what we are trying to do, the contemporary, no? And some people are calling this shift to the fluorescence.
Was there a second question? Okay.
Hi, I think your readings are quite interesting. I'm glad you're well published. This is a quick question that maybe relates to creativity, and you've already hinted at an answer in some respects, but I wonder if any of you would like to relate a sort of personal anecdote of the process, in the sense that if you've hit an obstacle in any of your writing, especially any of the bits you've read today, would you have considered writing either in an alternate form, if you say you were using an essay form and maybe considered that your obstacle might be overcome through poetry, or possibly even combining forms? I asked this question because I wrote an essay which was researched and is considered, I guess, an academic essay, but the thing ends with a poem. Not one I wrote, don't worry about that. It's actually a good poem by Wordsworth, 300 years old and quite dead, so he's reasonably respected as a poet, I think, still. But I wonder if, because that might help to say is the kinds of things that I didn't know how to say, so I wonder if that's something else that other people go through as writers. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question next to you that we're going to take, and then we'll let people respond.
I've noticed recently that there's an increased or renewed interest in the work of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and his manifesto, which makes me wonder if the Anthropocene is both an event, a climate event, and a field of study. And if that field of study has some kind of political valence, is there any convergence with reactionary, anti-modernist, or anti-modernity philosophical or political thinking? Not to suggest a convergence with Kaczynski himself, but...
And I'll leave that question for Dale. But the second question about first of all, in the very back, that the Anthropocene, I would very strongly resist to think it's a kind of self-evident thing that everybody agrees with. I don't even believe that a lot of people believe that climate change is real, and I think that's quite important, because I wrote a book that I want people to listen to, but I don't know who they are, and so I don't take for granted that they already know the answers. The genre thing, I do actually have a Wordsworth poem in this book that I kind of adapted, that one of my editors, not anybody in this room, said, "What is this right here? Why these words?" And I said, "That's Wordsworth." And I'm channeling Wordsworth. So I did actually mix a lot of genres. There's news stories, Wikipedia entries, radio broadcasts, there's all this stuff in there, because that's what we live in today. So as what said earlier, Roy was saying, we're all on these phones all the time. We have so much stuff, but it's not one genre anymore. So I thought the novel could be containing all these different ways of communicating. So I think that's really open. Academic essays, I don't know, people will let you publish it, that's different. So.
Okay, so first, change who we are, change our name. Sure. I'm not sure how to respond. I mean, I'm in Learning to Die, I'm sort of arguing that we should call ourselves the dead. We should just accept that and sort of come to terms with that, that this way of life, carbon capitalism, is done, and something else is coming. In terms of process and obstacles and form, yes, definitely, especially bringing in, trying to approach trying to get back to the words and what's happening at the level of syntax and what's happening with that sort of thing. Sentences and words and how they go together. What are the sounds? I write a lot by sound. And Ted Kaczynski, reactionary politics. All of us, whatever right-thinking people in this room, whoever we are, we don't own the problem, right? The problems that we're faced with are just there, and it's up to us to articulate our relation to the situation, and it's a dire situation, which is going to provoke a lot of different responses, and this is why I articulate a focus on sort of compassion and on the humanities and on reflective values, because as much as I think we are in a situation where our technology, our global civilization, our reliance on carbon has pushed us past a point of sustainability, I don't think the response to that is to start blowing people up or descend into reactionary nationalism. I also don't think the response is accelerationism. I abjure violence in all those forms. I think we're living in transition, times of transition, and I'm arguing for reflection and writing. So yeah.
This is just sort of one little tirade that I hope addresses a bunch of those issues that came up. All three of the questions. In my experience of living so far, being human is a lot more than being an intellect or having. And I'm increasingly doubtful about having things like rationalism, objectivity, and logic as actually usable, non-narrated tools. But even if, let's say, logic does work and the intellect does work, it's a great tool. And you would no more use a single tool for everything than you would a fork to wave hello to people or to comb your hair. And so there are all these other things at my disposal as a human being that I'm trying to get in touch with. And I hate having to preface this kind of thing by saying, here I go, I'm going to get hippy-dippy woo-woo. Because precisely what I'm trying to say is that it's okay to talk about love. It's a word we don't use a lot in academia. Why is that? What's wrong with saying that love is the answer and learning to do it on a daily basis, 1,000 times a day, might be the reaction rather than, a terrorist-leaning or, politically reactive, angry reaction. It's a lot harder to do, but I feel like art as a form to bear witness, not to be prescriptive or to try to change the world for better or not, is a good starting place to say, we don't know what this is, we don't know what's happening. Let's sit in it, let's bear witness, and hope that by so doing, some loving action will become obvious to us and we can take it. And that goes from, from your walk to work in the morning to much larger scale things. There's no shortage of opportunity to practice. And that's precisely what the Coda and my book and Dale's is about, that this is what has always been our challenge. It continues to be our challenge, but there might be a little bit more at stake, at least visibly now, than there has been.
Well, I think rather than me having the last word, it really should be the Beatles. But let me just say just a couple things. First of all, about the Kaczynski thing, which is actually quite interesting, and he does have a book that's being widely circulated now on the internet, and I actually think it's well worth reading. And one of the things that it actually does bring out that generally speaking, the environmental movement or environmentalism has never been a single thing. It's always been a kind of uneasy alliance between people with sort of pre-modern views, which Kaczynski takes to the extreme, and sort of postmodern constructivist views, which a lot of people who write in a sort of post-humanist vein take to an extreme. And that's all fine, but I think what should really trouble us and where reflection and critical thinking enters is that most of us are some uneasy contradiction of both of those tendencies, although not taken to either such extreme. And that's why all this is worth thinking about. I think I will end by saying something about the Anthropocene, though, since in a way the concept has been called into question, and it has been called into question a lot generally in the environmental humanities broadly construed. People want to talk about, no, it's not the Anthropocene, it's the Capitalocene, and have tended to see some kind of political agenda between the use of this term. And I think it's important to for me, and I think for Bonnie, if I dare speak for her as well, at least for us in this book, the term is an analytic term, really. It doesn't carry any huge moral baggage or huge moral freight. It's simply the recognition that the kind of world that we're living in now, the challenges that we face, the impact of humanity on the planet is quantitatively different, now transformed into being qualitatively different than it was at one time in human history. And really the central challenge of the Anthropocene is that collectively we are producing these outcomes that really almost none of us want, but yet, so never has humanity been so powerful, but yet individually we tend to feel powerless in trying to reverse this or to stem it. And that's what for Bonnie and I brings us back to love.
Thank you so much. Are there any further questions? Comments? Okay, so
I just want to say one thing.
No.
I do want to say something about love. So it's an answer, and fiction has something to do with love. It's to also. I don't believe this, Erich Murdoch. It's the difficulty to imagine someone else is real. I find that really bizarre. I don't think it's so difficult, but that's fine. That's her. I actually think it's to actually pay close and long attention to somebody. That is also love, and that's also fiction in a way. And fiction has something to do with love, and it's also to imagine that the other person actually imagines you as a whole being. That's a really rare thing, that the other person imagines you to be a whole, entire being. So I'm not sure, this kind of realist, like, oh, it makes people real, like, I don't know. But love, and then there's activism in politics, which I think is actually really important. It's just not love in a kind of, I love your book. And I think this is really important. I think love can also be channeled in ways, and that doesn't have to be with that one person somewhere, but there's politics and activism and elections and things like that, which still matter. Although we may all be dying, which I do get from your book, I know. But I think this is actually quite important. I think these other pieces of it so I think it's really useful to say it's an analytic tool, and we still have to do things, right? We still have to live, and living is actually even more than loving, right?
Well, I don't think there's quite that contrast, but between living and loving. But I mean, we could go on forever. But let me just say, I think there's two things going on here. One is I don't think any of us think anything we've said is on the side of quiescence, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we all think action is important, but I think that at least Bonnie and I think, and maybe the two of you too as well, that the challenges that we're facing at this particular moment are those that don't yield very easily to the old solutions and even the old forms of political action.
There's one question we're going to take before ending.
Well, it's not a question, just a comment. Also, just to thank you all very much for this fabulous conversation. I've been sitting here trying to formulate a question, and it keeps changing with every, every stage of the conversation. But I guess this is going to be about form, and a form that I picked up on in Roy's reading, and a form that I've noticed out there in climate change and environmental writing, and that's a form around the list. Mm-hmm. And it's been theorized in terms of Bruno Latour's interest in sort of litanies and this sheer effort sometimes that is needed to bring together the kind of vast plenitude of phenomena that we need to put together somehow to make sense of climate change, just the kind of the way that you were doing it. And I take that as some kind of outside of narrative or outside of story. I deeply appreciated what Bonnie was saying about The Anthropocene is also an opportunity for us to look at our own delusions. And one of our delusions as humanists is a great investment in story and in imagination. And I feel that when Bonnie talked about silence as being one of those places outside story and outside imagination, I think that's really worth exploring. And I do think it's a place of love as well. But the other outside, which is more in tune with literature and with language, is just the sheer phenomenological presence of things, of the world here. So I think that this list format that you were using, and the combining of cultural, scientific, and every other kind of phrase and word brings us into this new world that we're trying to reach, which is beyond all the stories we've always told ourselves. It's a world where we have to listen to things.
Yeah. I really appreciate you saying that, and that you picked up on that, because that's, I mean, of course, that's what it's doing, right? It's in that construction, I'm explicitly trying to juxtapose things of vastly different scales that are nonetheless connected in the world now. And there's a way in which I find the problem of story in the Anthropocene, or in relation to the idea of the Anthropocene, to be constantly challenging and a constant problem, because the basic elements of story are some kind of dissonance and then a resolution. It's like a sonata. I feel like I can't rely on any of the resolutions that come to hand, and the dissonances are at once too great, and on the other hand, they're somewhat beside the point, right? I don't want to focus on the dissonance, I want to focus on the connection. And so, finding ways to integrate non-story into story, or to just think about, to just push this question of form in how we are narrating the Anthropocene to ourselves, I think is very important. Yeah.
Can I just comment on your work too? Something I really admired about what Roy just read, and that speaks to this conversation, is it's not just a list like I think so many, and this listing is happening in all kinds of places right now too. You see it in a lot of storytelling. It's not just like the camera scanning over a landscape. It started like that, and then Roy disrupted it with things that you can't picture, like names of chemicals that you can hardly even pronounce. And I thought that was really, really smart, and it was powerful. I mean, I suddenly had like a blank polyboliblah in my head, and it was like, no, you don't get to sit back and watch this movie. That's not what this is about.
Right.
I think we're going to end, unless there's a burning comment somebody on the panel has to make before. So two things. One is the last event in the Environmental Humanities series for this semester is Captured at Sea on November 1st. We're very, very excited about that panel, which is on justice at sea, human trafficking, and aquaculture. And it's an amazing group of speakers. The second thing is that books are for sale outside, and I'm going to be buying some, and so should you. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great evening.